James Harris sat rigidly in the richly paneled office, his fingers clutching a creased funeral program like a lifeline. Only 72 hours had passed since he'd buried Rachel beneath a slate-colored sky, and now he found himself confronting a reality he never saw coming. Across from him, the estate attorney shifted behind a grand oak desk, adjusting his spectacles with clinical precision. His demeanor betrayed no emotion, his voice as calm as a weather report as he began reading. I, Rachel Harris, being of sound body and mind, declare this to be my final will and testament. James felt his throat constrict. Though the words weren't her voice, the echo of her presence in that formal language drove a sharp ache into his chest. It seemed impossible that she wouldn't suddenly walk in, vibrant and laughing, rather than exist only on printed pages and legal jargon. She'd always been meticulous, organized to a fault. James recalled how she'd insisted on writing wills the moment they closed on the seaside villa, that stunning cliffside retreat overlooking the Pacific, which they had sacrificed so much to afford. It was meant to be the setting of their golden years. Mornings would begin with the crash of waves, and evenings would end under blushing skies. Now grief mingled with reluctant admiration. Even in death, Rachel had made sure everything was accounted for, but nothing had prepared him for what the will held next. To my husband, James Harris, the lawyer continued, I leave our primary home on Elmwood Drive, our shared investment accounts, and my collection of personal jewelry. James gave a faint nod. These were logical, expected inheritances, the kind any spouse might anticipate. But the attorney kept going, his gaze lowering to the next section of the document. To M, my business associate, he read carefully, his brow tightening as he parsed the wording. I bequeath the coastal property in Monterey, including its furnishings and all belongings within. He hesitated. A heavy pause filled the room. This gift is not to be passed to my husband, but remains solely with M, as a gesture of appreciation for years of companionship and support. The air turned heavy. James blinked in disbelief, certain he had misunderstood. Not to her husband, but to M? I'm sorry, James broke in, his voice rough and dry. Who is M? What is that supposed to mean? The lawyer shifted again, a nervous tic revealing itself as he adjusted his glasses once more. The will refers to this person only by the initial M, he said. Identified as a business associate. There is a Monterey address included, but no full name. He sighed. Unusual, yes, but legally valid provided the individual can be verified. James's thoughts raced. Business associate. How many times had Rachel used that term without elaboration? I've got a late meeting with a business associate. Don't wait up. A business associate's in town. Each recollection struck like a blade, sharper now with suspicion. Was this who she had been referring to all along? His stomach twisted with a surge of disbelief and betrayal. Rachel had never mentioned anyone named M, not as a friend, let alone someone significant enough to inherit their dream home. The villa had been theirs, down to every detail, every tile, every brush of paint chosen side by side. It was the place where they'd once danced barefoot on the veranda, imagining decades of sunsets together. The attorney began again, his voice measured but gentle. I understand this is difficult. We can, of course, work to confirm M's identity. Per the instructions, this individual is to be contacted, and the transfer would proceed during probate. Unless there's a formal challenge to the will. He let the words settle, watching James with quiet concern. James realized he had halfway stood, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. His heart thundered, and he couldn't tell if it was sorrow, rage, or pure shock coursing through him. Likely all three. With effort, he eased himself back into the seat, willing his breath to steady. I don't understand, he whispered, his voice quaking. Why would she do this? The villa. She understood exactly what it represented to us. To me. The lawyer gently folded the will and looked at him with quiet sympathy. I wish I could give you more clarity. Sometimes people make choices in silence that we never expect. For what it's worth, apart from the villa, the remainder of the estate is legally yours. The house in Monterey had only ever been under Rachel's name, which meant she had full authority to leave it to anyone she pleased. To anyone she pleased. The words struck James like a cold slap. Rachel had chosen, even in death, to shatter his heart. and she'd done so deliberately. A hot sting pressed behind his eyes, but he refused to let it spill over. Not here. Not in front of this composed, well-meaning stranger. Not over her decision. He forced himself to focus on the concrete details, the sort Rachel herself would have clung to during a crisis. You mentioned there's an address? So this person is real? Not just an initial to confuse me? The lawyer gave a slow nod, flipping through the will again. Yes, right here. There's a property address in Monterey, California. I can write it down for you if you'd like. You have the right to know who's receiving it. Perhaps you even know them. James doubted that. He and Rachel had been married for over a decade, 12 years of shared life. She was his confidant, his partner, or so he'd thought. Surely he would have known if someone with a name starting with M had been part of her life in any significant way. Apparently he hadn't known her at all. He took the index card the lawyer held out. The address was typed in tidy black letters, and beneath it a name, Matthew Carlson. So that was M. The name meant nothing to him. James slowly shook his head as the realization settled like concrete in his chest. I've never heard of him, he muttered. The lawyer gave him a mild, rehearsed smile. Mr. Harris, sometimes wills contain surprises. People live their lives in compartments. Not every part is visible to everyone. Surprises. James felt heat rise in his chest at the condescension tucked inside the lawyer's kind tone. This wasn't about a trinket passed to a distant relative. This was their retreat, his and Rachel's, gifted to a man he had never heard of. No, he corrected himself grimly, not a stranger. If Rachel had given Matthew Carlson their shared dream home, then this man had been much more than that to her. The rest of the meeting slipped by in a haze of formalities James could barely register. The lawyer discussed probate, made mention of a no-contest clause designed to discourage disputes, and reassured James that his portion of the estate was unaffected. It was all background noise. He nodded automatically, accepted a copy of the will, and walked out of the office with lead in his limbs. Outside, the afternoon sun stabbed at his eyes. The city moved on, indifferent. Traffic crawled. Strangers bustled past him, sipping coffee and juggling briefcases. And yet James stood frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, his world undone all over again. 3 days. In 3 days, he had lost his wife, uncovered her betrayal, watched their shared future handed off to a man he had never met. Grief pulsed through him, raw and violent, but underneath it something hotter brewed. Rage. He walked slowly toward his car, replaying the lawyer's earlier words. May my business associate, companionship and counsel. Each phrase struck like a knife. Business associate? What kind of business associate inherited your home? Companionship counsel. In what? In secrecy? In deception? The questions churned like poison in his veins. James yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat, hands clenched tight around the wheel, the leather groaning beneath his grip. Rachel's betrayal wasn't just romantic, it was strategic. She had carefully arranged for her lover, this Matthew, to inherit the very place she and James had envisioned for their final chapters. A deliberate, posthumous wound. Had she imagined this moment? Him blindsided at the reading? Had she smiled at the idea? The thought made his stomach twist. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded will. Unfolding it with trembling fingers, he stared through a fog of hurt and fury. The villa. To Matthew Carlson. It struck him then. Rachel had gone to her grave with a hidden life, but she hadn't erased it completely. She'd left behind a clue, a name, an address, and James wasn't done. If Matthew Carlson had exercised just a bit more caution, he might have stayed hidden. But now James had found a loose end, and he was ready to tug. Whatever answers he needed about the man his wife had secretly loved, and the reasons behind her choices, they were now within reach. His thoughts turned to the villa above Crashing Way, its windows aglow in the early evening light. Rachel had claimed to love that house. To have passed it on to someone else, she must have loved him more. The realization seared through James, a cruel fire igniting inside the hollow ache of his sorrow. He swiped his sleeve across his face, rough and impatient. Tears could wait for the darkness of night. Right now, there was work to do. The truth of Rachel's life, however painful, however ugly, was his to uncover. If this Matthew had truly occupied the space in her heart and her home, then James would have to face that. As his car's engine came alive beneath him, he made a vow in silence. A vow to the woman he had once trusted with everything. Every falsehood would be exposed, every secret dragged from the shadows. Rachel had made her decisions. Now it was his turn. And Matthew Carlson, whoever he thought he was, would soon understand that James Harris didn't take betrayal quietly. Ghosts in the attic. That evening, the house on Elmwood Drive sat steeped in silence. James ascended the narrow staircase to the attic, each step sending tiny clouds of dust drifting in the pale light from his flashlight. The attic's lone bulb had burned out months ago, a small repair James had never gotten around to. Now it seemed absurdly unimportant, just another shard of the normal life he no longer recognized. The air up there was stale, thick with the stillness of long abandonment. This had always been Rachel's space. She was forever storing away mementos and old documents in the attic's corners and crawl spaces. If any part of her hidden life remained, it would be here. His heart beat erratically, thudding with both dread and the terrible pull of curiosity. He dragged out a heavy box marked Tax Documents 2015. Beneath the layers of expected folders, something unusual. A shoebox bound tightly in a silk scarf. Recognition jolted through him. The scarf was deep blue, studded with tiny silver stars. He had bought it for Rachel during their Santa Fe trip. She had adored it. So why was it up here wrapped around an old box forgotten? With shaking fingers, James unraveled the scarf and lifted the lid. A delicate trace of her perfume, jasmine and rose, drifted up, haunting and sudden like she had passed beside him. Inside were dozens of envelopes, worn and yellowed with age. Each one bore a lipstick-stamped seal where a return address should have been, arranged meticulously in chronological order. The top letter was dated 4 years ago. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold and looping. It was addressed simply to Rachel. James felt a vice tighten around his chest. That was around the same time she began taking frequent business trips, ones that never quite made sense. As if pulled by invisible strings, he slid the letter free and unfolded the aged paper beneath the flicker of his flashlight. My dearest R, last night was more than I ever imagined. Waking next to you, even in that run-down motel by the highway, was heaven. I hate that you have to return to him, but knowing you're thinking of me makes it bearable. 2 weeks apart feels unbearable. I'll be counting every hour. Yours, monsieur. The words swam as James's eyes filled with tears, hot and blinding. He gripped the letter tightly, his fingers trembling. The betrayal was no longer just suspicion. It was real, vivid, undeniable. 4 years. This wasn't a momentary weakness, not a recent crisis brought on by stress or illness. It was a long-running affair, calculated and hidden with cruel precision. He placed the first letter aside, his breathing shallow, and reached for another. This one was dated a year later. R. The Monterey house is almost finished. You should see the new veranda, our veranda. I can picture us there already, wine in hand, watching the sun melt into the sea. It's exactly what we dreamed of. Thank you for making me part of it. He still hasn't caught on, has he? There are moments when guilt nips at me. But then I recall why we're doing this. We're meant to belong in that seaside house. You and I, creating a life that always should have been ours. Forever, M. Each line carved deeper into James's soul like a blade twisting in slow motion. He could picture it vividly. Rachel and Matthew walking through the villa he once purchased for her. Matthew wandering through the very rooms James had painted by hand. Relaxing on the deck where James and Rachel toasted their 10th anniversary with champagne. The sheer boldness of it all made James tremble with fury. Why? He rasped into the silence, voice raw and broken. Only his own voice, faint and fading, came back to him. Shadows of the past began to slither out from every inch of the attic. Memories slipping in of Rachel returning from her business trips quieter, withdrawn, her eyes carrying a remorse he had dismissed as fatigue. The countless evenings he sat alone at the dinner table while she claimed to be stuck at work. Looking back now, the clues had been there. He'd simply refused to see them. He had trusted her with everything, loved her without question. Still, he forced himself to keep reading, letter after letter, as though building a case in a courtroom of ghosts. One note had Matthew mocking James's awful taste in wine, boasting about his own. Another included unsent drafts from Rachel, her handwriting unmistakable, telling Matthew that James was completely oblivious. The tone between them oscillated between fiery passion and shared secrets. The latest letter, dated just 2 months prior, shifted to something far more calculated. My love, once everything is finalized, you'll finally have what you've earned. The villa will be yours soon. The legal side is nearly done. I've made arrangements just in case. You know my situation. No matter what, I want our dream to live on. You've stood by me through so much, never wavering. I'm sorry it's taken so long. I know waiting hasn't been easy. James will never understand, and maybe that's for the best. I'd rather he despise my memory than uncover what we shared once I'm gone. That would be kinder, for everyone. All my love, R. James let the letter slip from his hands as though it had scorched him. My situation. What did she mean by that? To his knowledge, Rachel had never been sick. Or had she hidden that from him too? The words settled in his chest like iron. Rachel had foreseen the possibility of her own death and ensured the villa would go to Matthew. Maybe she'd even wanted James to discover the truth, only when she was no longer around to be questioned. She'd orchestrated everything with cruel precision. A maelstrom of grief and rage swirled inside him. Rachel's betrayal didn't die with her. She had scripted it to outlive her. Even in death, she had chosen to deceive him. She had wanted him to hate the version of her he'd remember, and in that she had succeeded. James pressed his palms hard into his eyes, fighting back a rising wave of emotion. He felt like a man staring into a future that had been suddenly and brutally erased. When he finally pulled himself together, he began gathering the scattered letters with painstaking care. Their words still echoed in his ears, too intimate, too cold. But among them he began to spot hints, fragments of something deeper. Matthew had written about the Monterey house as if it belonged to him. James began to realize Matthew might have influenced Rachel's choices, the furniture, the renovations, masked as advice, masked as help. Companionship and counsel. The phrase from her will now sounded laced with implication. As he reached the bottom of the box, something made a dull sound against the cardboard. He reached in and pulled out a small black USB drive tucked into a corner. Unmarked, plain ordinary. But James's pulse kicked up. What might this contain? Clutching the drive and the letters, he descended from the attic. The house around him felt unfamiliar now, filled with shadows that might hold even more betrayal. He stepped into the study, Rachel's study, and sat before her old laptop, its screen lifeless and layered with dust. As the machine powered on, he whispered a desperate hope that he could remember the password. The login box blinked to life. He entered Rachel's birthday. No match. He tried their wedding date next. Still wrong. His jaw clenched. He gave one last attempt, the name of the cat she adored as a child. A soft tone chimed. The screen unlocked. Even in her deception, some part of her remained familiar. James inserted the flash drive. Its icon appeared instantly, but the contents were unintelligible, jumbled characters. They were encrypted. Only one folder had a name, Memoir. Inside, that was a single file, its name a meaningless sequence of letters and numbers. His throat tightened. Could this be more proof of the affair, sealed and hidden? He opened it. A password prompt appeared. Naturally, he thought about the letters Rachel had exchanged with Matthew. If she tucked this drive among their love notes, the password might be connected to them. Not one of her usual codes, that was obvious. This was personal, meant for no one but her. He tried Matthew, rejected. Monterey, also wrong. James exhaled, steadying his breath. He thought back to the details in those letters. Had Matthew used a nickname for her? He skimmed through the handwritten drafts. One unsent letter ended with, "Forever yours, your songbird." Songbird. He had never heard her called that. She had never used the word around him. Fingers trembling, James typed, "Songbird." The folder unlocked. Inside was a single audio file. He clicked it. At first, only static. Then, her voice, Rachel's voice, clear as day. James gasped. It was like she was right beside him. But the words weren't meant for him. There was something venomously sweet in her tone, an edge he had never heard. "I can't believe he bought the Seattle conference story," she said. A cruel laugh followed, light, musical, the laugh he used to adore. Now it twisted in his ears. Then another voice joined in, low and smooth. A man. "Your husband still hasn't caught on, has he?" It had to be Matthew. James leaned in, every fiber of him coiled tight, fists clenched. "Not in the slightest," Rachel replied, glasses clinking softly in the background. They were celebrating. "James trusts me so completely," she added. "It's almost sweet how clueless he is." He felt his face flush with heat. "Helps us keep things simple," she said, giggling. The man laughed too. "To simple lives," he toasted. Rachel's laughter echoed again, sealing the moment. James couldn't listen any longer. He slammed the playback to a halt, breath ragged like he'd sprinted miles. The sound confirmed what the letters only hinted at. For years they had mocked him, used him, lied with smiles and laughter. And now he heard her, unmasked, unguarded, like a stranger who wore his wife's voice. The study was silent except for his uneven breathing. His gaze drifted to a framed picture on the desk. Him and Rachel, smiling on the villa's porch, arms entwined in golden light. A complete fabrication. Everything felt counterfeit. A rush of scalding grief surged through him, searing and purifying. Then came anger, cold, precise, devastating. Not the chaotic fury that had gripped him outside the lawyer's office. This was focused, pure. They had laughed at his devotion, taken his love and twisted it into their private joke. The shame, the betrayal, the pain, they nearly undid him. Yet beneath the surface, something unyielding shimmered, something dark and vindictive. James became aware that his hands had tightened around the edges of the will documents, which still lay where he had tossed them onto the desk earlier. His gaze skimmed past the dense legal language, beyond the allocations he'd already heard aloud, combing for any detail he might have ignored. In the haze of disbelief at the lawyer's office, he hadn't bothered to pay attention to the specifics. But now those overlooked specifics might be the very thing that offered him a way to strike back. Midway through the page, a clause stood out. Something about the Monterey Villa. James's breath hitched as he traced the tangled phrasing. Should the beneficiary, Matthew Carlson, referred to hereafter as M, ever be officially accused of illegal or deceptive conduct by a competent legal body, the inheritance of the Monterey coastal villa granted to him would be immediately nullified. In such a case, ownership of the property would revert to the estate, to be redistributed per the residuary clause. Specifically, it would be transferred to my surviving spouse, James Harris. James blinked hard as he reread it, once, twice, a third time, needing to be absolutely sure he wasn't fabricating it from desperation. Accused of fraud or crime, revoked, reassigned to the surviving spouse, to him. Rachel had left behind a snare. Whether it was deliberate or a twisted form of foresight, James couldn't say. But it was clear now. She had placed a condition on Matthew's windfall. If Matthew wasn't the honorable man she had painted him as, he stood to lose every benefit she'd entrusted to him. James let out a low, joyless laugh. "So," he whispered into the silence, "even after death you had your doubts about your prince, didn't you, Rachel?" Perhaps she had felt something off about Matthew, a flicker of unease she couldn't quite explain. Or perhaps she feared that the truth might eventually catch up to him, through enemies, through law, through fate. What other reason was there to add a clause like that? It was not a common safeguard. She had shielded her lover, yes, but also left behind a road to restitution, or retribution, for the man she'd cast aside. James gently replaced the papers in their envelope, slipping the accompanying flash drive into his pocket. His mind was a flurry of thoughts, all converging on one clear idea. Matthew Carlson may have seduced Rachel and twisted her loyalty, but if there were any stains on his reputation, any transgressions buried in his past, James now had a path to uncover them, and a means to destroy the reward Rachel had granted him. He recalled the tone of Matthew's voice on that recording, smooth, calculated, utterly self-assured. The voice of a man who expected to win, who knew how to take without asking. Men like that rarely played fair. They cheated not just in love, but everywhere. Was Matthew truly the upright businessman he claimed to be? Or had Rachel glimpsed the truth through her infatuation? If there was even a trace of wrongdoing to uncover, James would find it. Standing in that musty study, surrounded by remnants of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, James felt a cold resolve settle within him. Rachel had handed Matthew a gift in broad daylight and hidden a trap for him in legal fine print. James would spring that trap. He would turn Rachel's own words into a blade. He folded the will and slid it into a folder with care. This was no longer about the villa, or even the betrayal. This was about justice, whatever shape it needed to take. For days, James had worn the mask of a mourning husband, a man broken by loss, deceived by those he trusted most. But that mask had shattered. Tonight he stood reborn, no longer the passive casualty of cruel twists. In his place stood someone reforged by pain, driven by a singular hunger for justice. A man ready to descend into the depths, if that's what it took to undo the treachery carved into his life. He exhaled slowly, shoulders squaring with resolve. If there was even the smallest flaw in Matthew Carlson's carefully crafted life, James would find it and tear it open. Before this ended, Matthew would rue the day he ever crossed paths with Rachel Harris. The silence around him was thick, broken only by his voice, soft and venomous, as he addressed the shadows, be they Rachel's ghost or the lies hanging in the attic rafters. You thought I'd stay in the dark forever, Rachel. But I know now. I know everything. His teeth clenched as fury welled behind his eyes. And I swear, neither of you will gain anything from the lies you built. Above him, a faint creak echoed from the attic like a spectral nod of approval. And so James Harris began to chart the course of his retribution, beneath the facade. By dawn, a rare clarity had settled over James, something he hadn't felt since the nightmare began. The sting of betrayal still pulsed inside him, raw and insistent. But alongside it had come something else, direction, a mission. He would uncover whatever secrets Matthew Carlson was hiding and use them to activate the hidden clauses Rachel had written into her will. If there was even a trace of scandal around Matthew, James would drag it into the light. He started where anyone would. Sitting at his kitchen table, cradling a mug of black coffee, he opened his laptop and typed into the search bar, Matthew Carlson Monterey Business. The page filled with hits in seconds. News features, a polished LinkedIn profile, the corporate homepage of a company. Apparently, Matthew Carlson wasn't just anyone. He was a prominent name in the local business scene. CEO of an investment firm called Pacific Pinnacle Partners, headquartered in Monterey. His professional photo showed a man in his early 40s with neat, sandy blonde hair and a rehearsed, crowd-winning smile. James stared at that image. His jaw tensed. He clicked into an article from a regional business journal. The piece gushed praise, calling Matthew a sharp-minded financial strategist who had turned his firm into a leading player along the Central Coast. It highlighted his community involvement, including funding a marina restoration project. Matthew wasn't some shady outsider. He was a pillar of the community, a public success story. Of course Rachel had fallen for him. It made a twisted kind of sense. She had always been drawn to ambition, to prestige. Perhaps Matthew offered a sparkle that James, steady, predictable James, never could. He caught himself slipping into self-doubt and pulled back. This wasn't about him. This was about exposing Matthew. If the man wore a flawless public image, then his sins would be buried deep. James kept digging. Among the older articles, something snagged his attention. Brief mentions of Pacific Pinnacle's meteoric rise. One report hinted at past regulatory scrutiny, a footnote about the SEC having once investigated the firm. James opened the piece. Years ago, amid a volatile market period, Pacific Pinnacle had been questioned over suspicious trading activity. No charges were filed, and the case seemed to fizzle. Matthew had issued a bland public statement at the time, chalking the situation up to confusion and emphasizing the firm's commitment to compliance. It sounded rehearsed, convenient. To James, it smelled like a cover-up. He jotted down the dates and headlines. If federal regulators had once circled this man, it meant something had triggered concern. Maybe it had been buried, maybe paid off. But there was a trail. James was done reading. He located the firm's address on its website, a sleek office building in the heart of downtown Monterey. Without pause, he grabbed his car keys. Monterey was 2 hours away. That didn't matter. He was going now. As he drove along the winding Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean glittered beside him, indifferent and cold. Once this view had soothed him. Now it reminded him of that wretched villa and the life that had been ripped from him. With each passing mile, he clenched tighter to his resolve. Grief and fury burned in his veins like fuel. By early afternoon, James rolled into Monterey. The hunt had begun. The city's beauty, its aged adobe facades and the scent of salt on the breeze, barely registered with him as he made his way toward the headquarters of Pacific Pinnacle. The company occupied the upper levels of a sleek, glass-paneled skyscraper that overlooked the shimmering coastline. James parked a street over and lingered in his car, mentally rehearsing his next move. He couldn't just storm in demanding answers. That would be reckless. If Matthew caught wind of his presence, it could ruin everything. Instead, James opted for a quieter strategy, gathering intel before making any bold moves. He entered the lobby like any ordinary guest, taking in the layout, the guard station, the elevators, the polished floors. A digital board mounted near the entrance listed Pacific Pinnacle Partners, 14th floor. People in sharp suits walked through the lobby, probably returning from their lunch breaks. James approached the security desk, wearing a friendly smile and injecting just a touch of unease into his demeanor. "Hey there, I'm supposed to meet Mr. Carlson from Pacific Pinnacle," he lied smoothly, casually noting the guard's name tag. "I'm a bit early, though. Do you happen to know a good place to grab some coffee while I wait, Mike?" The guard, a warm-faced man in his 50s, nodded amiably. "Sure, there's a spot just around the corner. Or, if you'd prefer, there's a visitor lounge on the 5th floor, serves coffee and has Wi-Fi." "Perfect, thanks," James said, pretending to be grateful. He made as if to leave, then paused awkwardly, flashing a sheepish grin. "Actually, I think I left the appointment confirmation in my car. Would you mind ringing up Mr. Carlson's office? Just let them know James Harris is here. No pressure. I'm early. I just want them to know I made it into town in case they're running ahead of schedule." He held his breath as the guard picked up the receiver. It was risky. If Matthew answered or recognized his name, this whole act would unravel. But the odds were in his favor. CEOs didn't typically pick up lobby calls. "Security here," the guard said into the phone. "I've got a James Harris asking for Mr. Carlson. Says he has an appointment." There was a brief pause. "Understood. Thanks." The guard replaced the phone and offered an apologetic smile. "Sorry, sir. They don't have you listed. Mr. Carlson's assistant mentioned he's out for most of the day." James furrowed his brow, faking surprise. "Really? Huh. I must have mixed up the date. Sorry for the trouble." He left before the guard could ask any more questions, adrenaline spiking, but satisfied. At least now he knew. Matthew wasn't in the building. That was all he needed for the moment. He had no interest in confronting him just yet. What he needed now was insight from people inside the firm. James decided to head to the cafe Mike had mentioned. Maybe someone there would talk or at least slip up in casual conversation. The cafe sat just around the block, quaint and filled with natural light, offering a sweeping view of the water. He bought a coffee and took a seat close to a trio who looked like they worked at Pacific Pinnacle. 2 men and a woman still wearing their company badges, clearly on a break. Their conversation, just loud enough to carry, drifted his way. "I'm telling you, the numbers didn't add up," one of the men said, stirring his drink. "And when I brought it up, he brushed me off." The woman gave a knowing look. "That's because Curtis always plays the loyal soldier. He'd sign anything Carlson puts in front of him. Loyalty's one thing, but if this blows up, we're the ones who'll pay." James kept his head down, pretending to scroll through his phone, ears tuned to every word. The second man exhaled through his nose. "I looked over the ledgers twice. The gap's there. But if the boss says it's taken care of, I guess it is." Though his words said one thing, his voice lacked conviction. The woman leaned closer to the group, lowering her tone. "Taken care of how? Hiding the numbers until nobody can trace them? That wouldn't be new. Remember the scramble during last year's audit? If we hadn't gotten that extension, we'd have been roasted. She shook her head. Carlson always finds a way, but it's like playing with dynamite. James felt his heartbeat rise. They were talking about Matthew, without question, and from the sound of it, something shady was going on behind closed doors. He didn't dare interrupt, but moved to the condiment bar nearby to catch the rest of the conversation without drawing suspicion. "All I know," the first man added, voice quiet, "is I'm glad I'm not in accounting. Word is, they're getting pressured to redefine how we categorize certain assets. It's not just risky, it's downright dirty." With that, the group finished their drinks, tossed their cups, and exited the cafe, heading back to the office. Though nothing overtly illegal had been said, the hints alone were enough to fan the flames of James's suspicion. Matthew's reputation as the firm's golden boy wasn't as untarnished as it appeared, at least not from the inside. That was enough for James to begin digging deeper. He needed more than gossip. He needed proof. Over the following week, James plunged into an obsessive investigation. During the daylight hours, he wore a mask of courteous curiosity, but once night fell, he became a silent observer, slipping into the shadows. He spent his days gently nudging conversations forward, fishing for stray comments. By night, he melted into the dark, watching, listening, piecing things together. One afternoon, he made his way to the Monterey County Clerk's office, combing through public documents, business registrations, property ownership files, anything that might hint at wrongdoing involving Pacific Pinnacle. What he found was a tangle of LLCs connected to Matthew. Some of them looked like shell companies. One had just bought a yacht, another was tied to a stalled office development, left half-built and seemingly abandoned. There were large transactions taking place, but the movement of money seemed strange, disconnected from any clear business logic. By the time the office closed, James had compiled a list of entities, property records, and financial trails. It was far from a complete picture, but the outline suggested deception. It looked like Matthew could be moving funds covertly, possibly hiding liabilities or masking profits through these front companies. Later that night, James returned to Pacific Pinnacle's headquarters. He didn't risk going inside again. Instead, he sat in his car across the street, quietly monitoring the flow of people in and out of the building. He watched as janitorial crews arrived and left. A few employees stayed late, their silhouettes visible in upper windows before the floors went dark. On several nights, a single light on the 14th floor remained on long after the rest of the building had gone quiet. Was it Matthew burning the midnight oil? Or someone else entirely? Then, one night around 11 p.m., James's patience was rewarded. The building's front doors parted, and a man exited, glancing anxiously over his shoulder. He was young, early 30s at most, and carried a slim briefcase. Under the glow of a nearby streetlight, James recognized him. He'd seen the guy at the cafe, an employee at Pacific Pinnacle, one of the men murmuring about discrepancies in the numbers. Adrenaline surged through James. He followed at a careful distance as the man made his way toward a nearby parking garage. At that hour, the place was nearly deserted, the man's footsteps echoing through the concrete expanse. James moved silently, the sounds of his own steps drowned by those of his target. The man reached a silver sedan and fumbled in his pocket for keys. Just then, James emerged from the shadows. "Late night?" he asked gently. The man startled, nearly dropping his keys. "Jesus!" he gasped, spinning around, his face drawn tight with tension. In the low light, James could make out the name printed on the ID badge clipped to the man's waist. Eric Miller, senior analyst. "Sorry," James said quickly, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Didn't mean to scare you. I just think we might have a shared concern." "About Pacific Pinnacle." Eric's expression hardened. "Who are you?" "You're not with the company." "No," James admitted, taking a steady breath. He chose a partial truth. "I'm a journalist. Investigating Pacific Pinnacle. I overheard you talking about discrepancies. At the cafe, it was a gamble to admit he'd been eavesdropping, But instead of anger, Eric's face shifted into a look of alarm. "I really can't talk about that," he said abruptly. "I need to leave." He turned to go, but James stepped forward, voice still calm but firm. "I think you can talk," he said. "You're clearly worried, for a reason. Maybe it's not just a gut feeling. Maybe you've seen something. If there's fraud going on and it comes out, you could be protected, as a whistleblower. You could get ahead of it." Eric glanced around the dim garage, but they were alone. "This is madness," he murmured under his breath. Still, he hadn't walked away. That meant something. His fear and his conscience were locked in silent battle. James laid down another card. "Guys like Carlson," he said, his voice edged with a resentment that didn't require pretending. "They act like they're beyond consequence. They use people like you to clean up their messes, then disappear when things go south, leaving you to deal with the fallout." He leaned forward just a fraction. "You're already burning late nights fixing errors, right? How long do you think you can keep that up before it bites you?" Eric's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, which was response enough. "Help me," James said, softening his voice. "I can bring him down. I'll keep your name out of it as much as possible. There are ways to do this without putting you in the spotlight. You'd be doing the right thing and protecting yourself." Eric held his gaze, searching James's face. James tried to project calm, sincerity, understanding, all while hiding the white-hot loathing he felt for Matthew beneath a layer of measured concern. Seconds passed like minutes before Eric finally exhaled and gave the slightest nod. "Not here," he said under his breath. "Not now. Too risky." James nodded back, relief starting to thaw his tension. "Tomorrow night, then. Your call on the location." Eric hesitated, then said, "Pier 27, the old cannery down by the water. There's a lot behind it, usually empty. 9 o'clock. I'll bring everything." Before James could respond, Eric turned and got into his car. The engine roared to life, headlights flaring, and within moments he was gone, leaving James alone in the dim, echoing garage, adrenaline pulsing through his veins. A rush of satisfaction welled up in him. This was it, the break he needed. If Eric's files proved what James suspected about Pacific Pinnacle, then Matthew wouldn't be able to wriggle out this time. James pulled out his phone and opened the voice recorder. He quietly narrated the exchange, names, time, place, capturing every detail while it was still fresh. Not that he'd forget. As he walked toward his own car, he allowed himself the smallest, tightest smile. Rachel's will required an official accusation for Matthew to lose the fortune. And now, with what Eric might bring, James could drop a bomb in the laps of the SEC, maybe even the FBI. If charges followed, Matthew's empire would go up in smoke. But he had to tread carefully. If Matthew even suspected a leak, he'd either destroy the evidence or scare Eric into silence. Timing was everything. Swift, surgical, final. That night, for the first time since Rachel's memorial, James slept without waking, the sleep of someone who knows the trap is nearly sprung. The fog off Monterey Bay crept inland, heavy and salt-laced as night wore on. By 9 p.m., the back lot of Pier 27 was cloaked in darkness. A single faulty street lamp casting intermittent flickers. James waited, half hidden behind a stack of splintered pallets, his nerves stretched tight. Every rustle of breeze through the deserted yard kept him alert. If Matthew even suspected betrayal, Eric might already be in danger. So might he. At last, headlights emerged through the fog. Eric's car coasted into the lot and rolled to a stop. He stepped out, briefcase in hand, and scanned the shadows. James stepped into view. "You're alone?" Eric asked, voice low. "Yes," James answered. "You weren't followed?" Eric shook his head. "I took the long way, circled around twice. I think I'm in the clear." James nodded and motioned toward the pallets. They shifted to a darker corner out of sight from the street. Two outlines in the gloom, cloaked in secrecy, behind closed doors. There were no doors here, only night and fog. But the phrase echoed through James's mind. What they were doing had to stay hidden, at least until the hammer came down. Eric set the briefcase down on a pallet and unlatched the clasps. Inside, a stack of manila folders rested alongside a single USB drive. His fingers hovered uncertainly above them, and James noticed the slight tremor in his hand. "This is everything I could dig up," Eric said under his breath. There are copies of internal memos, financial statements, emails I forwarded to my personal inbox and archived. He glanced around, lowering his voice. If they find out I took any of this, they won't, James replied, his tone calm but firm. I'll do everything I can to keep your name out of it. You're doing the right thing. He placed a steadying hand on Eric's shoulder. Eric gave a faint, uneasy smile. I just couldn't keep pretending anymore, he said. Carlson's been rerouting client money into dummy entities, doctoring the reports to make it seem like the fund is performing spectacularly. On paper, we look untouchable, like we're outpacing the market every quarter. But it's all a fabrication. He's using fresh investments to cover old losses. It's basically a Ponzi scheme. He hesitated, then added, and the so-called consulting fees? They're going to a shell company. I'm almost certain he's skimming cash for himself. James listened in grim silence. It was worse than he'd thought. Matthew wasn't just defrauding him. He was deceiving everyone. How long has this been going on? He asked. 3 years at least. Maybe longer, Eric replied. He pulled one document from the pile, pointing to a figure he had highlighted. Here, this was a real estate venture Carlson's private LLC tried to launch. It tanked, but instead of taking the hit, he dumped the losses onto our clients' portfolios. He disguised the failure by fabricating a loan repayment that never actually happened. I've got emails between him and Curtis Lee, the CFO, talking about how to creatively manage the optics. He thumbed through more pages, his long-suppressed conscience spilling out. And look at these. Offshore transfers to the Cayman Islands. The accounts are under an alias, but I traced them back to Matthew. Wire receipts are all there. If the regulators get their hands on this, Carlson's done for. He might take all of us with him. He paused. But staying silent would only delay the inevitable. This whole operation is a ticking bomb. James felt a mix of gratitude and determination surge through him. You're showing a lot of courage, Eric. I'll make sure this reaches the right authorities, and I'll do my best to keep you safe. He took the folders and the USB, carefully tucking them into his own bag. The scale of the deception was staggering, but it was the breakthrough he needed. If Matthew was charged with securities fraud, Rachel would have all the ammunition she needed. He'd lose the villa, probably his freedom, too. Eric snapped the now empty briefcase shut, anxiety and relief written across his face. What happens next? He asked. James had already thought it through on the drive over. Tomorrow morning I take this to the authorities, the SEC, FBI, anyone who'll listen. And with this evidence, they will listen. You might get a call or a visit. But whistleblower laws should keep your identity out of the public eye for now. He paused. After that, they'll probably act fast. The quicker they move, the less time Carlson has to cover his tracks. Eric gave a slow nod. Our next board meeting is the morning after tomorrow, he said. All the senior execs and board members will be there in person at headquarters. If you're looking for a moment when his guard's down, Eric said, voice dropping low, that'd be it. He didn't need to elaborate. The implication hung in the air like smoke. James allowed the faintest curve of a smile. Everything was falling into place. Thank you, Eric, he said quietly. You've gone above and beyond. Go home. Pretend everything's normal. Erase our messages, all of them. I'll take it from here. Eric's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He reached out and shook James's hand. Good luck. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry about your wife. I didn't know her personally, he continued, eyes flicking downward. But I figured out Carlson had a woman staying at that villa. Didn't realize it was her until recently. Saw her name on some paperwork. She was listed as the beneficiary. He gave a short, bitter laugh. He even used company money to maintain the place. No shame at all. James's jaw clenched so tightly it ached. As if betrayal weren't enough, Matthew had financed his treachery with firm resources. He gave a simple nod. Thanks. Their hands parted. In Eric's expression, James could see a storm, unease, regret, a flicker of redemption. With one last anxious glance at the fog-covered street, Eric turned and disappeared into his vehicle, taillights glowing faintly as he sped into the darkness. Now alone, James took a slow breath and placed a calming hand on the satchel slung at his side, the one stuffed with evidence. Got you, he whispered to no one. picturing Matthew's face crumbling beneath the weight of truth. 2 days later, under a pale Monterey sunrise, James stood once again in the atrium of Pacific Pinnacle Partners. But this time he hadn't come alone. On either side of him stood two government officials, Karen Liu from the SEC and Mark Delgado, a special agent with the FBI. The previous day had been consumed by hours of interviews at the federal building, poring over documents, walking through timelines, backing every accusation with irrefutable proof from Eric's stash. They'd taken his claims seriously, very seriously. The evidence was damning. Warrants had been issued in secret. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been looped in. The plan was to seize records, confront Carlson, and lay the groundwork for potential charges. It was just after 7 a.m. The board meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock up on the 14th floor. As office staff trickled into the building, some cast furtive glances at the grim-looking trio in their midst, especially at Karen, whose badge clipped to her belt hinted at what was coming. James's pulse thudded steadily in his chest. Delgado had outfitted him with a wire, just in case Matthew said something damning on tape. Technically, justice was already underway, but James had made it clear. He needed to be there in person. "I have a personal investment," he'd told them, setting aside his journalist facade and revealing the truth. Despite protocol, they'd let him come. Delgado, in particular, had a soft spot for irony. "Sometimes karma needs an audience," he'd said. Karen had agreed, if only because she suspected James's presence might throw Carlson off balance. At the security desk, the same guard from James's last visit looked up in recognition. "Mr. Harris?" he said, startled. James nodded sharply. "Morning. We're here for Mr. Carlson. He's expecting us." A half-truth. Carlson expected someone, just not this. Karen stepped forward, flipping open a folder and displaying the court order. "Federal agents," she said crisply. "We need immediate access to the boardroom." The guard's eyes widened as he skimmed the document and caught sight of the firearm beneath Delgado's jacket. "Oh, of course," he stammered, fumbling for his phone and the scanner on his desk. "They're already in a meeting, but I'll send you up." The elevator doors slid shut, carrying the three of them upward. When they stepped off on the top floor, a gleaming plaque pointed them toward a pair of imposing frosted glass doors. Muffled voices came from within. Casual conversation, the kind exchanged before a meeting begins. As they drew closer, James caught a familiar cadence. Matthew, smooth, upbeat, talking about projections, company growth. Without knocking, Delgado stepped forward and pushed open the doors. Silence slammed into the room like a wave. The boardroom gleamed with quiet opulence. Polished mahogany stretched the length of the table. High-backed leather chairs lined both sides, and an expanse of glass looked out across the sparkling bay. Seated around the table were several board members in tailored suits, with a few faces displayed on video screens, remote participants joining from afar. At the head of the table stood Matthew Carlson, his presence commanding in a sharp navy suit, one hand wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. His expression shifted, irritation at first, then confusion, and finally a flicker of familiarity, as James entered behind a pair of federal agents. "What's going on here?" Matthew demanded, regaining control of his features as he carefully set the mug down. The board members exchanged stunned glances, clearly rattled by the sudden intrusion. Agent Karen Liu stepped forward, all business, her badge held aloft. "Karen Liu, Securities and Exchange Commission," she said. "Mr. Carlson, I'm going to need you to step away from the table. We're executing a federal warrant to search the premises and seize documents related to an investigation into embezzlement and securities fraud." A heavy silence dropped over the room like a curtain. Matthew's expression faltered, barely, a flash of panic tightening his jaw, his eyes flaring slightly before he recovered with a tense smile. "There must be a misunderstanding. This is highly inappropriate." "We're well within jurisdiction," Agent Delgado cut in smoothly. "This is no longer just a private meeting." He turned his calm focus on the rest of the room. "Please stay where you are. This won't take long." Two more agents entered and quietly took up positions. one securing the doorway, the other making for the computer and the cabinets lining the back wall. Matthew's eyes snapped to James. "You!" he spat, his voice sharp and low, his polished tone crumbling. "What are you doing here?" James moved forward with measured steps, carrying the gravity of years betrayed, weeks of revelations solidifying into a steady, tempered rage. For the first time, he truly looked at the man standing at the head of the table, the man who had loved his wife, who had plotted behind his back, who had dismantled everything he had held dear. And there he was, exactly the composed, dangerous charmer James had imagined. But now, the first signs of panic clung to him, the slight sheen of sweat, the strain around his mouth. "Hello, Matthew," James said evenly, his voice calm, deliberate. He wanted to drink in the moment but kept his composure. "I'm here to make sure you finally face the consequences." Matthew scoffed, throwing a quick glance around the room as if seeking a lifeline. "What is this?" he said mockingly. "Is this a joke? Who even is this man?" A dignified woman with silver hair cleared her throat, her voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Carlson, I believe he introduced himself as James." James met her gaze and nodded. "James Harris," he said, turning to the entire room. His voice was steady, just loud enough to command the space. "I'm sorry for the disruption, but this couldn't wait. I'm the widower of Rachel Harris, your CEO's former business partner." The title landed like a weight, heavy with implied betrayal. A red flush crept into Matthew's cheeks at the mention. Recognition sparked in a few eyes around the table. Perhaps some had heard of Rachel, at least in passing, perhaps more. Matthew stiffened. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "He's not even part of this investigation." "He has no dash dash." "Actually," Agent Liu interrupted coolly, "he is." She turned to James briefly before continuing. "Mr. Harris came forward with essential evidence. He's here today as a cooperating witness." The statement bent the full truth slightly, but James appreciated the endorsement. Matthew's mask cracked. His voice rose, bristling with fury. "You think you can storm in here with baseless claims and drag my name through the mud in front of my board?" He jabbed a trembling finger at James. "I don't know what kind of fantasy you've spun for them, but I built this company from the ground up. I don't know what lies you've told, but this is nothing but defamation." James allowed himself a slight cold smile. "It's only defamation if it's false," he replied, voice icy calm. "And we both know it's not." Agent Delgado stepped closer, his hand resting firmly on Matthew's arm. "That's enough," he said. "Mr. Carlson, please move aside. We'll be collecting several devices for evidence." Matthew jerked his arm away violently. "Don't touch me," he growled. The carefully crafted image he had worn for years was unraveling, thread by thread, revealing the raw panic of a man cornered. One board member stood suddenly, alarm etched across their face. "Matthew, maybe it's time you started cooperating." "Sit down, Alan." Matthew's voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. Alan recoiled slightly, clearly stung, and dropped back into his seat without another word. No one is confiscating anything without a fight. "I want to speak to someone in charge," he demanded. "Your objection is duly noted," Agent Liu replied calmly, unaffected. She gestured toward the agent holding Matthew's laptop. "We're operating under the authority of a federal court order," she said. "You'll receive full documentation after the search is completed. You'll have ample opportunity to review it with your legal team. For now, stand aside and let us proceed." Matthew turned sharply toward James, his glare simmering with hatred. "This is your fault," he spat. "You couldn't handle that she picked me." "That she loved me? You're pathetic." James clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His voice trembled, low but laced with fury. "She chose you? Is that what you've convinced yourself? That she preferred a liar and a con artist? A man who stole from people who trusted him? Don't you dare twist her choices like that. You used her, Matthew, just like you used everyone." Matthew's expression twisted, old bitterness boiling to the surface. "She loved me," he hissed. "Everything she did, lying to you, giving me the house, she did because we were going to build a future you were never part of. You bored her, James. She told me. We laughed at you. You think dragging me into some made-up accounting scandal changes any of that? James's vision narrowed, adrenaline pumping hard through his veins. He recognized the man in front of him, the same vicious voice from the recordings, the one who had helped unravel his marriage with cold calculation. "Watch yourself," Agent Delgado warned, stepping in between them. But James didn't move, and Delgado didn't fully block his view. "Made up accounting issues?" James said, his laugh sharp and cold. "Is that what you call laundering money and falsifying financial reports? Is that what you call moving millions offshore while deceiving clients and regulators?" He turned to the board members, his voice rising with righteous clarity. "This man has lied to every one of you. Lied to investors, lied to the SEC. I have the evidence. The feds do too." He jabbed a finger toward Matthew, the weight of years of betrayal focused into a single accusation. "And do you know what else he lied about? He lied to my wife. Maybe she did love him in her own damaged way, but even she didn't trust him completely. Want to know how I know?" Matthew's smug mask flickered. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snapped, but his voice wavered slightly. James stepped closer, nearly chest to chest now, with federal agents bracketing them like shadows. "Rachel's will," James said. "There's a clause in it about you. If you were ever formally charged with a crime, any kind of fraud or misconduct, the villa reverts to her estate, which means it comes back to me." For the first time, Matthew's face paled with genuine shock. "No," he whispered. "She wouldn't have done that." "She did," James confirmed, and a sharp ache of grief twisted in his chest. "Maybe even she had doubts about you in the end. Or maybe she just wanted to believe you were better than you really were. Either way, she gave me the key to take you down, and I just used it." A pulse beat visibly in Matthew's temple. His shock broke like a wave crashing into fury. With a howl, he lunged, throwing a wild punch at James's face. James barely had time to react. He flinched backward, and the fist glanced off his cheekbone rather than striking squarely. Pain shot through his face, but the rush of adrenaline kept it distant. Before Matthew could swing again, James struck back with a fierce right hook, years of pain and rage packed into the blow. His fist slammed into Matthew's jaw with a sickening crack, sending him staggering into the edge of the conference table. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Some board members shouted in panic. One of the remote video screens blinked out as someone frantically disconnected. Matthew straightened, snarling like an animal, blood on his lip. He launched at James again, but this time Delgado and Liu were ready. They seized him by both arms, hauling him backward. Matthew thrashed against them, cursing and spitting in James's direction. "You bastard, I'll kill you!" "That's enough," Agent Liu snapped, twisting one of his arms behind his back with brutal precision. She snapped the cuffs on his wrists before he could resist further. "Matthew Carlson, you are under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, and violations of federal financial law. You have the right to remain silent." She continued reading him his rights while Matthew struggled, weaker now, his face pressed to the table under Delgado's steady grip. James stood motionless, chest heaving, his right hand throbbing from the blow and a stinging heat flaring across his cheek. One of the board members had already picked up a phone, likely calling the company's legal team or internal security. The rest sat frozen in disbelief, watching the man they had trusted as their CEO being handcuffed in the middle of their boardroom. Breathing heavily, face flushed with rage, Matthew turned just enough to cast a seething glare at James. "This isn't the end," he snarled, his voice rough with fury as Agent Delgado yanked him to his feet. "You hear me, Harris? One way or another, I'll make you pay." James took a calm step forward, smoothing his jacket, reclaiming a measure of control. His voice was quiet but unwavering, slicing through Matthew's bitter threats. "You already destroyed everything that mattered to me, Matthew," he said. "There's nothing left you can touch." He motioned around the lavish boardroom, its polished surfaces now tainted by the morning's chaos. "Take a good look. This empire of yours, it's crumbling, and when the dust settles, I'll still be here." Matthew's mouth twisted as he drew in a breath to answer, but Agent Delgado cut him off, steering him toward the exit. "Watch your step," Delgado said flatly, shoving the disgraced executive out through the door, where a growing crowd of stunned employees and alert security guards waited in the hallway. Agent Liu stayed behind for a few moments, overseeing the last details as her team secured the remaining evidence. She offered James a curt nod, respect, recognition, and a touch of awe. "Mr. Harris, someone from our office will follow up with you soon," she said. "And good luck." There was a thread of empathy in her voice. James returned the nod, his face drawn but steady. "Thank you, Agent." As Matthew's angry shouts faded down the corridor, James let his eyes drift around the boardroom one final time. The room, moments ago tense and stifling, now felt somehow lighter. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting warm gold over the sleek furniture and revealing a tranquil blue bay beyond, where the fog had begun to lift. He glanced down and noticed his hands trembling. From the surge of adrenaline, or maybe from the release of something far deeper, possibly both. The board members, seated in awkward silence, avoided his gaze. Some looked guilty, others simply looked lost. James cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured, "I apologize for the interruption. But I imagine you all have much to talk about." With that, he turned and strode from the room, leaving behind an echoing silence. In the hallway, staff stepped aside to let him pass, many staring in disbelief as they recognized the man who had just unraveled everything. Out of the corner of his eye, James caught sight of Matthew being forced into an elevator, his head lowered, flanked by agents. Their eyes met briefly. Matthew's gaze was full of venomous promise, a fury rooted in defeat. James's held none of that, just an icy certainty. When the elevator doors slid shut, closing Matthew Carlson off from his own shattered legacy, James felt something inside him ease at last. It was done. With truth and a measure of Rachel's own quiet brilliance, he had dismantled the fortress of lies that had ruined so much. Now, one final step remained: to return to the place where it had all begun, to face the pieces of a past still waiting in silence, air of justice. 3 months later, under the soft hues of an autumn evening, James Harris stood on the veranda of a coastal villa overlooking Monterey Bay, watching the sun surrender to the sea. The sky burned with shades of amber and violet, the kind of twilight Rachel had always loved. But now he watched alone. The breeze carried a gentle chill, brushing against his face, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of waves breaking in the distance. The villa was his again, legally, completely, undeniably his. In the aftermath of Matthew's downfall, the legal machinery had turned in his favor. Rachel's will had included a clause, unusual but ironclad, that nullified the property's transfer the moment criminal charges were filed. It had passed through probate swiftly, and the villa reverted to Rachel's estate and to James, her surviving husband. Matthew's legal team had threatened to fight it, calling the clause unreasonable, even absurd. But with their client behind bars and his reputation in tatters, their threats held no weight. Eventually, they backed down and relinquished any claim. Meanwhile, Matthew's financial house of cards collapsed. Regulators froze his accounts, and a court-appointed receiver began sorting the wreckage, working to recover funds for victims of the fraud. In the process, investigators discovered a covert key man life insurance policy, one meant to safeguard the firm if Matthew were to die or become incapacitated. Once his deception came to light, the insurance company opted to settle quickly, paying a substantial sum to avoid a lengthy lawsuit from the defrauded investors. After the restitution process concluded, an unexpected portion of the funds ended up with Rachel's estate, an outcome no one had foreseen. She had owned a small share in Pacific Pinnacle, a stake she had acquired at Matthew's urging. It was a cruel, ironic turn of events. The unraveling of Matthew's deceit had left James not only in possession of the house, but also with a sizable financial windfall. By all appearances, he had come out on top. He was the clear victor in a saga marked by betrayal and fraud. Matthew Carlson now faced a host of criminal charges, each carrying the potential for decades behind bars. Their dream home, the villa, was back under James's name. His financial position had never been stronger, bolstered by court awards and settlements. From the outside, it seemed that justice had been served, decisively and without delay. Yet as James stood on the veranda, palms resting lightly on the railing, he felt none of the triumph he'd once envisioned. The truth was that the victory rang hollow. The salty wind drifted in from the ocean, brushing past him into the vast, quiet house where echoes had replaced voices. Where once he had pictured joy, family, and the warmth of a shared life, now only silence and memory lingered. He stepped back inside, the glass door sliding shut behind him with a muted sigh. The living room remained untouched, just as it had been when he left months earlier. Decorated in soft blues and creamy tones, its elegance was a reflection of choices he and Rachel had once made together. But now, every piece of furniture felt staged, like remnants of a performance whose cast would never return. James moved slowly through the villa, his footsteps the only sound in rooms that once brimmed with life. He had returned a week ago, determined not to surrender the space to Matthew's treachery. Maybe he'd hoped that by re-inhabiting the house, he could recapture some piece of the life he'd lost. Instead, being back only underscored how irreparably broken that life had become. In a small study nook, a cardboard box sat undisturbed, the same one he'd carried from the Elmwood Drive property. It held Rachel's personal effects, and James still didn't know what to do with them. Among them were her letters, testaments to betrayal he had forced himself to reread over recent weeks, searching for any overlooked sign of remorse, any thread of lingering love. But they offered little comfort. The Rachel depicted in her words was foreign to him, fiery, manipulative, deliberate. In one unsent letter addressed to Matthew, she had written, "I wish I could make it right for everyone, but life doesn't work that way." James didn't know what she meant. Who had she wanted to make it right for? Him? Herself? Matthew? He exhaled heavily and closed the box. The weight of those letters and what they revealed was too much for tonight. Instead, he picked up a framed photograph from the side table. It showed him and Rachel on the veranda the day the villa was completed, smiling against the sun's glow, elated and full of hope. She had insisted they take that picture, saying she wanted to mark the beginning of their new journey. Now, gazing at it, James felt a deep, dull ache. Had that moment meant anything to her? Or had she already begun constructing another life, a separate reality she kept hidden from him? His thumb grazed the image of her face. Despite everything, he longed for her, not the Rachel who had lied, but the woman he thought he had known, the partner he had trusted. That woman, he realized now, had never truly existed. She was a figure he had built in his mind, shaped by love and illusion. The real Rachel was gone, lost not only to death, but also to the painful truths that had surfaced. "Why did you do it?" His voice was barely a whisper, directed at the smiling image in his hand. He had asked that question countless times, but it remained unanswered. Perhaps even Rachel herself didn't fully understand why she had woven such a web of deceit. A soft chime from the grandfather clock down the hall pulled James from his thoughts. Dusk had surrendered tonight, and the house had dimmed. He set the photograph back in its place and moved toward a lamp, his hand hesitating at the switch. Instead, he turned and walked once more onto the veranda. Above, the stars had begun to scatter across the sky. Below, the sea stretched into blackness, its rhythm unchanged. He remembered how Rachel used to sit out here, wrapped in a blanket, pressed against him as they watched the stars in silence. Those nights had felt sacred, untouched by the world. Now they belonged to memory. Now those recollections carried a bitter taste, equal measures of sweetness and ache. James rested his arms on the balcony railing once more. "I reclaimed everything, Rach," he said quietly into the wind. "The house, the justice, all that you stole from me. I came out on top." His throat tightened as he swallowed hard. Then why did it still feel like defeat? The breeze from the ocean was the only response. Of course, he already knew the answer. Regaining possessions could never fill the void left by lost trust. or replace the love and loyalty that had once been the cornerstone of his life. This elegant villa was only stone and wood, glass and paint. It meant nothing without the honesty and affection that should have made it a home. Right now it felt like a showpiece of deception, stunning but soulless. A house built on untruths. That phrase struck him like a mournful echo. In truth, the dream he'd once chased had been constructed on secrets and broken vows. Maybe that was why it felt so empty now. The walls had never truly held the love he believed he had given. So he stood there alone in the vast hush of that grand estate, the silence nearly overwhelming. His retaliation had been necessary. He didn't regret unveiling Matthew's treachery for even a second. The man deserved every bit of disgrace that followed. And Rachel? She'd chosen her path. If she were still alive, what then? James couldn't even imagine how such a meeting would have unfolded. Perhaps it was better that things ended the way they did, with her absent when the truth came crashing down. Still, the ache lingered. Justice wouldn't hold him at night, nor would it smile at him in the morning. Moral victory was cold comfort where a wife's love should have been, where a shared future had once existed. He shut his eyes and drew in a breath of sharp sea air. Maybe time would dull the ache. Maybe this place could feel like home someday, if he let new memories grow within its walls. Or maybe he'd sell it, walk away from its tainted past and start over elsewhere. That decision hadn't been made yet. For now, he simply existed in the aftermath, searching for some sense of purpose in the rubble of the life he'd lost. A faint sound came through the wind, a distant bird's call, or the boards beneath him groaning in the salt air. For just a second, it resembled Rachel's laugh, that light, melodious sound he used to love. His eyes began to sting. Whether from the cold or from tears, he didn't know. "You got what you wanted, Rachel," he whispered, his voice barely rising above the hush of the sea. "I really do hate your memory, just like you said I would." And it did make things easier, but also more painful than she could have ever guessed. Running a hand through his hair, he stood straighter. That was enough. He'd sworn not to be consumed by bitterness. He had come through this with his spirit intact, damaged, yes, but still whole. That, in its own way, was a small victory. He thought of the others Matthew had deceived, people who had trusted him and paid dearly for it. They too had suffered under the weight of lies. But many would rebuild. James would have to do the same. He hoped someday that laughter, real laughter, would fill these rooms. Laughter from friends, from family, or from something honest and new. If not, at the very least, this place would no longer be a monument to betrayal. He would see to that. Turning away, he stepped back inside and secured the door behind him. The roar of the ocean faded to a murmur. Inside, the house was still and quiet. The faint trace of vanilla, her favorite scent, lingered in the air, from the candle he had lit earlier, a small gesture to push back the emptiness. He glanced around the shadowed foyer and living room one final time. This was what remained. A man and a house, both patched together from what had been broken. He drew a slow breath, his shoulders rising with newfound strength. Yes, he was alone, but he was still standing. Indeed, the quiet pressed down like a weight. Still, he had survived, and the harsh clarity of the truth, however unwelcome, had freed him from the burden of living inside a falsehood not his own. Eventually, he would learn to let the stillness become something gentler, something that might even pass for peace. For now, the old house perched above the cliffs would continue its solitary vigil over the restless sea, and he would endure the solitude it mirrored within him. This wasn't the conclusion he had hoped for, but it was the one shaped by the decisions of those he'd once held close and lost. James switched off the lights and began the slow climb upstairs, his footsteps resonating through the emptiness. In the absence of light, the villa offered no revelations, only the quiet suggestion of another day waiting just beyond the horizon. And within that fragile, uncertain promise, James realized, lay the only legacy that was truly his.